All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a pretty wild concept: how the whole idea of growing up has completely shapeshifted throughout history. When we think of childhood now, we picture playgrounds, schools, and a super long protected runway into adulthood. But as we're going to see from the data we've gathered, that modern version of childhood, yeah, it's actually a remarkably recent invention. Just take a look at this. Childhood is the most vile and abject state of human nature. I mean, wow, right? That is from Pierre de Bérulle, a 17th century French cleric. And the crazy thing is, this wasn't just some isolated, grumpy guy. This actually reflects a massive historical mindset. Back then, early life wasn't this precious, innocent time we cherish today. It was seen as this flawed, almost lowly state that a human literally just had to survive and overcome on their way to adulthood. So, looking at a quote like that forces us to ask a startling question: has childhood even always existed? Obviously, kids being physically smaller and biologically developing, that's a scientific fact. But the way society understands, treats, and categorizes that immaturity, that is entirely a social construct. It's totally dependent on your culture, your geography, and the exact era you happen to be born into. To really wrap our heads around this, let's trace it on our timeline. We're going to start way back in ancient Rome, travel through the Middle Ages, hit the Enlightenment, and finally land right in the 20th century. Section 1. Surviving Ancient Roman Infancy, a Fight for Life. So, back in ancient Rome, simply surviving was your very first milestone. Without modern medicine, childbirth was incredibly perilous for both the mother and the baby. In fact, it was so dangerous that Roman babies weren't even officially named until they were 8 or 9 days old. 8 days for girls, 9 for boys. The mortality risk in those first few weeks was just so tragically high that families actively delayed the official naming ceremony, which they called the dies listrigus. And get this, there wasn't even a formal mourning period required if an infant died under a year old. It's a really harsh reality check on their survival rates. But okay, let's say a child did survive those perilous early days. Once they made it, they were integrated into Roman society with some very specific markers. At that naming ceremony, they'd receive a bulla. It was a special amulet they wore to identify them as freeborn citizens. The Romans also actually offered them some legal protections. They recognized this concept called doli inca pax, which basically meant a kid under the age of puberty was considered incapable of criminal intent. But do not mistake this for a life of pure leisure. By age 8, children were fully expected to be contributing to the household with meaningful, everyday chores. And this meant the runway of youth was incredibly short. We are talking about transitioning to adulthood and literally even getting married as shockingly early as age 12 for girls and 14 for boys. At 14, a boy would formally take off that protective bulla, put on the toga of manhood, and boom, he was thrust directly into adult responsibilities and family life. It was 0 to 60 real fast. Moving into Section 2, the miniature adult myth, Philippe Arié and the Middle Ages. Jumping forward to the Middle Ages, there's this massive academic debate sparked by historian Philippe Ariès. He famously, and I should add pretty controversially, argued that medieval society completely lacked our concept of childhood. He pointed straight to art, like this 12th century sculpture of the Virgin and Child. Look closely at the infant Jesus. He doesn't look like a baby, does he? He's literally depicted as a small-scale, miniature adult. He's got adult proportions, adult musculature, just shrunk down. For Arias, this was hard proof that the Middle Ages just didn't understand childhood as a distinct phase of life. And to back up this theory, historians point to some super fascinating linguistic clues. Medieval writers didn't even have a strict vocabulary to separate kids from adults. Take the French word garçon or the Latin puer. They were used incredibly loosely. The exact same word could mean a 5-year-old child or a 30-year-old adult servant. It really suggests a society where childhood just kind of blended invisibly into this broader, general category of being dependent on someone else. All right, Section 3, Enlightenment and Innocent Children, a philosophical pivot. So moving into the 18th and 19th centuries, we see this huge, fascinating clash of ideologies. On one hand, you had the older Puritan view, which literally saw children as inherently tainted. They were vividly described as bundles of original sin who needed really strict discipline to have their willful nature corrected. But then contrast that with Enlightenment philosopher John Locke's total game-changer of an idea in 1693. He argued for tabula rasa, the idea that a child is essentially born as blank white paper. They aren't born good or evil. Rather, they are 100% molded by their education and their environment. And artists and thinkers took Locke's blank slate idea and just ran with it. Looking at Joshua Reynolds' painting here, aptly titled The Age of Innocence, we see the Romantics actually inventing the idea of the innocent child that we're so familiar with today. Thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau started arguing that children are actually born inherently good and pure. And plot twist, it's adult society that ends up corrupting them. It totally flipped that old Puritan bundle of sin view right on its head. Which brings us to Section 4, the discovery of adolescence, defining the teen years. As we rolled into the 20th century, society realized, hey, we need a completely new category here, a buffer zone between child and adult. Honestly, it wasn't even until around 1904 that American psychologist G. Stanley Hall officially popularized the term adolescence. He defined it as this unique, prolonged developmental stage characterized by storm and stress. But here's the kicker. This didn't just happen because human biology suddenly changed. It happened because the Industrial Revolution totally rewired society. Child labor laws and the rise of mandatory schooling suddenly kept young people out of the workforce. It segregated them with their peers, and essentially it manufactured the teenage years as we know them today. So think about oral tradition for a second. Just like humans have spent millennia passing down cultural stories around a fire, these shifting definitions of childhood, they're basically just the cultural stories we tell ourselves about what kids should be. From miniature adults to bundles of sin, to innocent blank slates, to stressed out teenagers, we literally construct the version of childhood that our specific society needs at that moment in time. And the wild part is, our journey isn't over. The definition of growing up is absolutely not set in stone. As our world keeps changing at breakneck speed with the rise of the digital age, artificial intelligence, shifting global economies, we have to ask ourselves, how is the next generation going to redefine childhood? And when historians look back 100 years from now, how are they going to describe the story we're writing right this very minute?